What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? What's good, families? Me, Coach 67 Sports TV. Shout out to the awesome and amazing LDBC, Lions Den Broadcasting Community. Shout out to the Louisiana All America Sports Network. Shout out to M Vision Photography and Video. He did a phenomenal job on the 2025 Southern University Blue versus Gold Spring Game Post Game Reaction Part 2. If you have not seen the 2025 Southern University Blue versus Gold Spring Game Post Game Reaction Part 2, please go check it out. It wasn't just a spring game, it was a movie. I mean, we did it big. Myself and M Vision Photography and Video. I'm not even gonna lie, I gotta give him like major props. He did an excellent job in terms of, shooting, all of the, little bit of footage we did get. We could have gotten more, but, we just kind of limited to that. We plan on doing it bigger and better for the next event we're going to do. So, Vision Photography and Video, if you need video or photography for weddings, events, interviews, like myself, I'm going to need that eventually. Real estate, baby showers, music videos, commercials, parties. Please hit up Envision Photography and Video or Marlon Harvey on Facebook or Instagram. Go check him out. And shout out to the greatest university in the world, the Southern University, home of the mighty Jaguars. In this particular live stream, I'm going to talk about Southern University top 5 wide receiver combinations. Before I actually get into the actual live stream itself, I want to give a major shout out to all the Facebook groups that I'm in. Major shout out to Southern University Sports and Swag Nation HBCU Excellence, which is my Facebook group. Major shout out to the Jaguar Plaza. Major shout out to Jagged Out. Major shout out to SWAC and Sports Talk. Major shout out to Ava's Heat and Roughing the SWAC. Major shout out to SWAC Sports Central. Major shout out to What's Up Issue. Major shout out to SWAC and the Fool Podcast. They not only have a podcast, they not only have a YouTube channel, but they also have a Facebook group. Shout out to them. And shout out to SWAC Beef. I know I'm missing a couple because I'm in like 15 of them. But major shout out to all the Facebook groups that I'm in. In this particular live stream, I'm going to talk about Southern University top 5 wide receiver combinations. And in this particular live stream, let me give you my real quick criteria. I did a live stream. No, in fact, I'm sorry, it was a video breaking down Southern University top 5 wide receivers. We just in that live stream or that video, it was just the individual wide receivers. And then, of course, GOAT status is anybody that's like a NFL Hall of Famer, like Harold Carmichael. He GOAT status is wide receiver, Southern University. Then after that is my top 5 wide receivers in terms of the Pete Richardson era to now. And then, of course, Michael Hayes was number 1. And I kind of worked my way back. With all my lists, I start from the bottom and I work my way to the top. And in addition to that, all of my groups and all of my lists in terms of top 5, top 10 Southern University position groups or whatever the case may be, it's the Pete Richardson era to now, because that's kind of really my first like recollection of Southern University football. And like I was telling somebody in the chat, I think it was Desmond Allen, major shout out to everybody that's constantly interacting with me in the chats, Desmond Allen and Adrian Crook, Edwin Moore, Blackwater Bayou, just everybody that's showing a lot of love. And a lot of times I don't like to start naming names because I'm going to forget people, and I don't want nobody to feel left out. But major shout out to everybody who's been rocking with me since day one. Major shout out to everybody that constantly shows myself and the channel support. I am less than 300 subscribers away from that magical, majestic 1,000 subscriber mark. So if you're not done so already, please subscribe to the channel. Also like and share the content. But no further delay. Let me jump right into the list. And as usual with all my lists, it's the Pete Richardson era to now. And in addition to that, I'll start my way from the bottom and I'll work my way to the top. First, honorable mention, wide receiver group or wide receiver core from year before last. This includes August Petrie III, Jalen Howard, Cassius Allen, Chandler Whitfield, and Darren Morris. The reason why this particular group is not higher on the list and they are honorable mention, just to keep it a buck, the reason why they are at the bottom is a group is because their trigger man, I'm going to just keep it a buck. Harold Blood left a lot to be desired. Is a quarterback. Had this group of core wide receivers, had they played with a quarterback like Quincy Richard, like Bryant Lee, like Terrence Levy, like a Sam George, like a Eric Randall, had they played with a better quarterback, more than likely, they'll probably be much higher in terms of wide receiver groups. But I'm not gonna lie, I think August Petrie III would have been a fool, and he would have been a dog with the right quarterback. And then in addition to that, you had Jalen Howard, who could take the top off of defense. You had Cassius Allen, who was a tall, rangy receiver. He can go deep, but primarily in that particular year, Southern used him as like a possession receiver to really keep the chains moving. He would go across the middle with, constantly on crossing routes, slants, that type of thing. And Chandler Whitfield, he was another one. With that quartet of wide receivers, and then Darren Morris, he kind of was like the icing on the cake. With that particular group, you really didn't know who you was going to put your best cornerback on because, excuse me, if you put your best cornerback on Jalen Howard, then, August Petrie III was going to get off. You put your best cornerback on August Petrie III, Jalen Howard was going to get off. In short yardage situation when they need to keep the chains moving, Cassius Allen really was the guy to look at. And then Chandler Whitfield, he made big plays too. And then and the crazy thing about it is this coming year, Darren Morris is going to be the number one. More than likely, he's going to be the number one wide receiver for Southern University. He was the fifth wide receiver for this particular group. So that kind of tells you how good this particular wide receiving group was. The problem was they just didn't have the right trigger man at the quarterback position. Next honorable mention. That was the first honorable mention. Next honorable mention is Willie Quinn and Mike Jones. I know people are going to be like, man, coach, why aren't they higher in terms of a combination? The reason why they're not higher because some of these other – no, in fact, I'm sorry. Hold on one second. Hold on one second, fam. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm back. Scratch that. This was the wrong list. The first honorable mention slot was right. The next honorable mention slot is Gerard Landry and James Vernon. So under them is August Petrie III, Chandler Howard, Cassius Allen, Chandler Whitfield, and Darren Morris. Right above them is Gerard Landry and James Vernon. I know some people are going to be like, Coach, James Vernon was a better wide receiver than Gerard Landry. Why you got Gerard Landry and James Vernon? Well, first and foremost, Gerard Landry played at Southern longer than James Vernon. That's first and foremost in terms of a combination. Second of all, for those individuals that don't know, Gerard Landry is Jarvis Landry, who played at LSU, played for the Miami Dolphins and Cleveland Browns and New Orleans Saints. Gerard Landry is Jarvis Landry's older brother. And at Southern University, Gerard Landry was a dog. He was a big, strong, physical, like possession type receiver. The closest comparison I can make to him from a college standpoint is Josh Reed at LSU. But in terms of NFL wide receivers, I would compare him to someone like a Anquan Boldin. Like, you couldn't play press coverage on Gerard Landry because he was too big, he was too strong, he was too physical. He was going to push the smaller, SWAC defensive backs out the way. You couldn't play often because he was going to get to his spot anyway. He was shorthanded. He was going to make the catch, and he was going to get to wherever he was trying to get to anyway. So he was the big, strong, physical wide receiver of that combination. James Vernon was the fast, speedy, shifty wide receiver. You know, people say that he ran a 4.3 40. We really never really kind of nailed down what his actual 40 time was. The reason why this particular combination of wide receivers is not higher on the list because, again, their offensive line just was trash. And the starting quarterback at the time, J.C. Lewis, they just got J.C. Lewis killed because, you know, I talked to people that actually played with J.C. Lewis. It was like, coach, from a talent standpoint, J.C. Lewis was he was a good quarterback, but his offensive line just was trash. That was like one of the worst offensive lines I've seen in Southern. The offensive line with J.C. Lewis at quarterback, and I'm not gonna lie, they got him killed. You know, people that played on or around the team at the time, the way they were talking, like he got like a lot of concussions or whatever. The reason being because his offensive line was trash. But in terms of a wide receiver combination, this was like the perfect combination. You got your big, strong, physical possession wide receiver with Gerard Landry. You got your speed guy that you was sending in motion. And as a combination, it was just awesome as a duo. Major shout out to Phil Smith. He said Mike Hayes. Well, this is not individual Southern University wide receivers. This is Southern University wide receiver combinations. So you got to come up with a duo, a trio, a quartet of wide receivers. He also put Keith Woods. Shout out to my brother Brent Fox. He says salute Coach 67 Sports TV. Just wanted to show some support. I appreciate you, fam. But back to what I was saying in terms of Gerard Landry and James Vernon. Once James Vernon filled off the team, and it was Gerard Landry by itself. You know, Gerard Landry still did damage. Again, you couldn't play press coverage on Gerard Landry because he was just too big, he was too strong, he was too physical. You couldn't press coverage. Couldn't play him in press coverage, just one. Second of all, you couldn't play often because he still was going to get to his spot and make the catch. And then in some instances, you know, if he got a little bit of momentum going, he got a full hit of steam, and that's a bad combination. So once James Vernon failed off the team, it really got to a point where what teams would do is they would play bracket coverage, meaning they would put a cornerback, not in press coverage, because playing press coverage on Gerard Landry was like a bad combination. You know, it was, you know, you asking for trouble trying to press Gerard Landry because he was too big, too strong, too physical. So you wouldn't play way off him because you don't want to play too far off him. You don't want to play him too tight, but you play him that right distance, and then you bracket him with a linebacker and with a safety. And I remember my mom and I, we went to I can't think of who it was. It was like UAPB or Alabama State. It was one of the two his senior year. And what they did was they just bracketed him the whole game. He really couldn't get off. And I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of mad with Pete Richardson in a coaching staff from an offensive standpoint. Because I'm like, this dude is a dog. Y'all can't get him the ball no kind of way. And I know, you know, he wasn't really a motion guy. You wasn't going to send Gerard Landry in motion because that really wasn't his thing. James Vernon was the wide receiver of the two that kind of went in motion. And by that point, like, they last year together, James Vernon wasn't eligible academically, so he had filled off the team. So you wasn't going to send Gerard Landry in motion. I didn't understand, like, why they didn't stack him, why they didn't put him in stack twins. stack trips, why they didn't run some type of pick play for him to free him up to get him open. Or all they did was, for the most part, they had trips or quads to the opposite side. They put him to the single wide receiver side by himself, and he just got bracketed the whole game. He might only had like 2 catches the whole game, and it was like real short catches. I'm like, man, come on, man. Like, bro, y'all got to do a better job using this guy. It really just kind of aggravated me the way they used Gerard Landry that particular game. And I think SWAC teams kind of followed suit in terms of, how they were going to play him. By this point, the offensive line play had picked up. But without James Vernon, like opposite of him to take away some of that tension, like he just got bracketed a lot. Jacob Ward was saying Gerard Landry torch a future first-round pick back in 07. I'm not going to lie. Gerard Landry was a dog. Like I said, big, strong, physical. A lot of what you see that James Landry had, Jarvis Landry had in terms of from a physicality standpoint, he was able to take what Gerard Landry did at Southern, and Jarvis Landry was able to take it to a whole other stratosphere when he was in high school and then when he went on to LSU and then the NFL. He had a lot of Gerard Landry's physicality, but he was faster than Gerard Landry. Gerard Landry ended up being drafted by the Arizona Cardinals, and they took him and they moved him from wide receiver to fullback, and he didn't end up making the team. But I think he was best suited to play wide receiver. I just go to show you how physical he was. They want him to play fullback in the NFL, but it really, that was a bad idea in my personal opinion. Salute to Straight to the Point Sports and Entertainment. Salute to your fam. My brother Brent Fox said, please smash the like button. Please do so. And Straight to the Point Sports and Entertainment say glad they picked up Shiloh. Yeah, maybe shout out to the whole Sanders family. My brother Jay Good, salute. Salute to Aldine Saddam, salute to your family. And he was saying Jarvis Landry was low-key way better hands than ODB, Odell Beckham Jr. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, those two both in college and in the NFL, they were a heck of a wide receiver combination in terms of from an LSU standpoint and from an NFL standpoint. So I got my first 2 honorable mention slots out the way. At the bottom, we had August Petrie III, Jalen Howard, Cassius Allen, Chandler Whitfield, and Darren Morris. And then we had Gerard Landry and James Vernon. Next, at the number 5 slot, we got Willie Quinn and Mike Jones. For individuals that don't know, Willie Quinn was, in terms of my top five Southern University wide receivers, P. Richardson era to now, Willie Quinn is at the number 2 slot for that particular, position group. Willie Quinn was like 5'4", 5'5". He had 4.3 speed. He was a real short, quick, shifty wide receiver. He ran a lot of crossing routes, a lot of slants, a lot of curls, and he just was so fast. The issue with him was he was short, so he had a small catch radius. So that's why he was better on like crossing routes and slants. He was better in terms of across the field stuff and short intermediate stuff. There were a few instances where they would run him on deep stuff, but he was so short that he had a small catch radius, and he could have the defensive back beat significantly. However, he was so short that a lot of times, if the defensive back had good recovery speed, then they would kind of close in on him and knock the ball away because he was so short. So he was a heck of a punt and kick returner. Like, he was a dynamic punt and kick returner. So, he was good at the crossing routes and that type of stuff. Whereas Mike Jones was the speed wide receiver that really, Mike Jones only ran two route combinations. 2 routes. He ran a go route and he ran a post. He didn't do nothing else. And, Mike Jones was so fast, he could kind of take the top off the defense. So you definitely couldn't play press coverage on Mike Jones. Your best bet was to play way off him and just hope he didn't just run by you, because he didn't run like no short routes. Everything was deep. Either he ran a go route or he ran a post. That primarily was his the routes he ran. And as a combination, they were like deadly, because Mike Jones would take the top off the defense. And if you didn't have a fast enough defensive back to stay with Mike Jones, he would just run by him and he would score a touchdown. And the previous year, he dropped a lot of passes. Well, really the previous couple of years, he dropped a lot of passes. So the reason why he didn't get as many passes thrown his way was because he dropped a lot of passes. But by that last year, he didn't drop as many passes. Just to kind of give you an analogy, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Unnecessary Roughness with Scott Bakula and Sinbad and everybody that was in that movie. Mike Jones was kind of like, he was kind of like Featherstone or Stonehenge in terms of Mike Jones dropped a lot of passes. But that last year, he did a better job catching the ball. He was more of a track guy, he had a track background. So that was the reason why he ran like a lot of like deep routes, because, he was a speed guy. And like I said, his primary route was a go route. So as a wide receiver combination, this was like the perfect combination in terms of Mike Jones was able to take the top off of defense, and Willie Quinn was able to work that short to intermediate stuff in terms of, short to intermediate stuff from the standpoint of he could run crossing routes, he can run slants, he can run curls, and it was a combination. They were like deadly. The reason why they are not higher, they hit the number 5 slot and not higher, the reason being is because of the simple fact that they didn't win a SWAC championship. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, Coach, Devontae Kincaid was at Grambling at the time, and then, before that, they lost to Alcorn State. That's cool, but, I know they didn't play on the opposite side of the ball. They didn't play on defense. They didn't have one of the better defenses at Southern, but at the end of the day, as a wide receiver combination, Willie Quinn was the number 1 receiver. Mike Jones was the number 2 receiver. Man, hey, they did damage as a wide receiver combination. So they hit the number 5 slot. Casanova said, you don't have 5 wide receivers who deserve to be mentioned here. Well, first of all, it's not individual wide receivers, it's wide receiver combinations. And he said, sorry, not sorry. This clearly must be one of my J State haters. This because this kind of sound a lot like Avis Heat. Avis Heat constantly say, hey, you don't have top 5 this, top 5 that at Southern that really deserve to be mentioned. He was saying rose-colored glasses, stop it, man. Man, I ain't gonna lie, this sound a lot like Avis Heat, to keep it a buck. Jacob Ward said this wasn't on that team in 13. They wasn't on the team in 13. No. I'm not saying yeah, that's my point. That's the reason why they're not higher in terms of is the combination itself. They wasn't on the team that won a SWAC championship. So that's the reason why they're not higher on this particular list. Carlos Brown, salute to your fam. But at the number 5 spot, we got Willie Quinn and Mike Jones. At the number 4 spot, we have Fred Bailey, Kenyatta Sparks, and Donnell Baker. And, of course, this particular trio wide receivers, they ended up winning the SWAC championship with Eric Randall is the trigger man pulling the trigger. First of all, in terms of Fred Bailey and Kenyatta Sparks, this was a dynamic duo in terms of punt and kick returning. Man, you could not kick the ball to Fred Bailey or Kenyatta Sparks. You couldn't punt the ball to either one of them, and you couldn't kick it deep to either one of them. So both of the two of them, once they got the ball in the open field, they got the ball in space, it was a wrap. So teams would constantly avoid trying to kick the ball to Fred Bailey, and they would kick it to Kenyatta Sparks, and he would make a house call, or they will avoid kicking it to Kenyatta Sparks and kick to Fred Bailey. He would make a house call. So it got to a point towards the end of the season where teams would try to square kick it to avoid kicking it to either one of them. So that's how dominant of a wide receiver combination in terms of putting kick returners they were. And then you add in Donnell Baker to the combination. Donnell Baker was 6'5". You know, he ran like a 10-3, 10-400 meter. And essentially, these three guys were like literally, they were like three members of a track team. So for all intents and purposes, once you got the three of these guys the ball in space, you know, it was a wrap. The reason why the three of them didn't get more touches from a wide receiver standpoint was at the time under Pete Richardson, they ran like this Florida State pro-style offense. So they primarily ran the ball with Melvin Williams Jr. And when they did go to spread, sometimes they would throw Melvin Williams Jr. that swing pass out the backfield. But Fred Bailey was the number one wide receiver. Kenyatta Sparks was number two wide receiver. And then Donnell Baker, even though he was the one that ended up making it to NFL training camps because of his size, he was 6'5", but he really wasn't like a Michael Hayes type of, like, we're going to throw you 50-50 ball so you can high point the ball, that type of thing. He was more of a speed guy, you know, run crossing routes and then just run all the way across the field and take it to the house. So these were like three track guys. If I'm not mistaken, I think these were like three of the four guys that was on Southern University 4x100 relay team at the time, if I'm not mistaken. So you got three track guys. You got, of course, at the time, you know, you got Eric Randall is the trigger man at quarterback. So this was a heck of a wide receiver combination. At the time, Fred Bailey ended up being an all-time leading wide receiver at Southern University because, you know, this combination of wide receivers, you know, they played together for a while at Southern. So, you know, Fred Bailey was the man his senior year. I think he ended up having like 600 some receiving yards. And I know some people might be like, well, coach, it's not a lot of yards, but the reason being, the thing people don't take into consideration was at the time Southern was a run-heavy offense. So their primary focal point offensively was running the ball as opposed to passing the ball. That's the reason why Fred Bailey didn't have more wide receiving yards. That's the reason why Kenyatta Sparks and Donnell Baker didn't have more wide receiving yards. So they are at the number, they're at the number 4 spot. The number 3 spot, we have Lee Dawson, Willie Quinn. Now, I know a lot of people was like, Coach, I know you already mentioned Willie Quinn earlier. However, this particular instance, Willie Quinn wasn't the number 1 wide receiver. He was the number 2 wide receiver. You know, Lee Dawson was the primary wide receiver. He was the man in terms of, you know, he could run a curl, he could run a crossing route, and he just was dangerous as a wide receiver. Now, he's not as fast as some of the other wide receivers on this particular list. You know, in terms of maybe guys like a Mike Jones, a Fred Bailey, a Kenyatta Sparks. He is not as fast as those guys, but in terms of Lee Dawson as being a guy that could get open, you know, he was a guy that could get open, a guy that really just kind of made things happen. You know, he had that year that Southern ended up winning the SWAC championship. You know, he had a big SWAC championship game. He had a big Bayou Classic. So Lee Dawson was the man. You know, he constantly made plays. And when teams took him away, you know, Willie Quinn made plays. You had Dre Joseph is the guy, the trigger man at the quarterback position. You know, Lenard Tillery at running back. So I'm not gonna lie, this was like a three-headed monster in terms of from an offensive standpoint. You had the right quarterback. Salute to my brother Big Joe Townsend. Salute to your fam. You know, you had the right guy at quarterback who was a senior. You know, he had been through the down years. Well, Stump Mitchell was the head coach. You know, you got Lenard Tillery at running back. You had Lee Dawes is your primary wide receiver. Willie Quinn is the secondary guy. So, I mean, I'm not going to lie. You really had it. You really kind of had it all clicking with that particular team from an offensive standpoint. So, that was the number 3 slot with Willie Quinn and Lee Dawes. I'm sorry, not Willie Quinn and Lee Dawes. Lee Dawes and Willie Quinn because, you know, Lee Dawes was the primary wide receiver for this particular group. At the number 2 slot, you got Alfred Art and Chris Davis. Man, when Southern University won the SWAC championship with Quincy Reshaw as the signal caller, man, these guys were like a dynamic duo. You really can't say either guy was the number 1 wide receiver, because guess what? If you gave more attention to Alfred Art, Chris Davis got off. If you gave more attention to Chris Davis than Alfred Art got off, man, you would have games where Quincy Reshaw would throw a couple touchdowns to each one of these guys. So that's how dynamic of a 1-2 punch they were. You really can't say a 1-2 punch. It was more like a 1 and 1A, 1A and 1B. You really can't even say 1A and 1B. The reason being is because, Alfred Art constantly got off. Chris Davis constantly got off. And Alfred Art was so good as an athlete. He was like the top player, one of the top 2 players on Southern University's baseball team. And he was able to make it, to the major leagues, whatever the case may be. But Alfred Art was a dog. Chris Davis was a dog. Then you had Quincy Reshaw at the quarterback position. And the crazy thing about it is, he was saying no love for John Foreman. He is an SU Hall. No, see, I'm not going to lie. First of all, I preface this by saying all the time, the unfortunate thing for John Foreman is he played for Stump Mitchell for one. Second of all, this is not individual like wide receivers. These are like wide receiver combinations. So this is not Chris Davis. I'm sorry, this is not Chris Davis individually. This is not Alfred Art individually. This is Chris Davis and Alfred Art is a wide receiver combination. Because even if we're gonna say at the time you double Alfred Art. If you double Alfred Art, Chris Davis was gonna get off. So just say you double Chris Davis, then Alfred Art was gonna get off. So if you look at all throughout their season, whether it's a SWAC championship game, the SWAC championship game, it wasn't as effective because Quincy Reshaw ended up getting hurt during the SWAC championship game, and Thomas Ricks was a very good quarterback that next year, but for whatever reason, I don't think really Pete Richardson really trusted him as much as he should have, even though he almost beat out Quincy Reshaw to be the starting quarterback. But Quincy Reshaw held him off, beat him out, and he ended up, being the guy. He had earned his stripes. He had went through his growing pains. Those 3 years as a starter. I'm sorry, the 2 years as a starter prior to that year. And, T.R. Ricks was more of the dual threat quarterback of the 2 quarterbacks, whereas Quincy Reshaw was more the pocket passer. Both of them could pass, and both of them could run, but Quincy Reshaw was more the passer that could run, whereas Thomas Ricks was more of the runner that could pass, if that makes sense. So we talking about as a wide receiver combination. We're not talking about them individually. So, John Foreman, he was a dog just individually, whereas Chris Davis and Alfred Art as a combination were both dogs. So that's what kind of is the beauty of this particular list, because whether we talking about, even if we skip past, if we go one slot below Alfred Art and Chris Davis, if you double Willie Quinn, then Lee Dawes got off. If you double Lee Dawes, Willie Quinn got off. So that's the beauty of this list. This is not individual wide receivers. These are wide receiver combinations. So again, Alfred Art and Chris Davis, man, they had so many big games where, one or both of them had, at least one touchdown and at least 100 yards receiving. So I remember this one game because, that particular season, they ended up being like starting out 6-0, and Don D.C. Carey and Alcorn State ended up coming to town. And that was the only game they lost the whole season. And I'm not gonna lie, I remember Coach Richardson on TV. He was like, man, we undefeated, we 6-0, but we overconfident, we cocky, we arrogant, we whoop the woo. And I'm like, dang, man, he really pushing this issue. He kept talking about it. And I had a business class at the time, even though, I ended up graduating in education. I was kind of like a double major at the time, and I ended up taking business classes and education classes. And one of the guys was in this business class that was on the team, and he was like, yeah, Coach Richardson really concerned that we're going to lose this game because he feel like we think we're invincible. We overlooking Alcorn State and whoop. And sure enough, I kid you not, for this particular game, Alcorn State ended up beating Southern 28-24. And the crazy thing about it is both Chris Davis and Alfred all had a good game. Quincy Richard had a good game, but well, let me phrase it. He had a decent game. He didn't have as good a game up to his standards because that year that he was dynamic the whole season. But that one particular game, he had a little bit of a down game. He turned the ball over a few times. And basically, Alcorn State ended up going up, towards the end of the game. So at the end of the game, you had like less than a minute left, whatever. And, he just had an off night that night. And he used to like to go deep a lot, throw a lot of go routes, through a lot of posts. And he ended up throwing an interception towards the end of the game. And Alcorn State ended up beating Southern 28-24 that particular night. And, Coach Richardson had warned them the whole leading up to that point, like they were too arrogant, they were too cocky. He said it the whole week, on the news. A couple of players said it, and sure enough, they were right. They ended up losing that game. But that was the only game they lost their whole season. They ended up running the table outside of that one loss to Alcorn State. But number 2 slot, we have Alfred Art and Chris Davis. At the number 1 spot, I know a lot of people, it's kind of obvious, if you follow my channel, Jacob Ward was saying they had 5 stars at wide receiver on that 03 squad. JV, James Vernon, Bridges, and Joseph to the mix. Yeah. Of course, they were in the mix, but the top 2 dogs on that wide receiving core was Chris Davis and Alfred Art. And the thing about it is, even when you really didn't throw the ball to the Alfred Art and Chris Davis, like especially James Vernon. I mean, James Vernon made plays too, but he hadn't really cut his teeth yet, like he did once those guys left, and he was able to be the top dog on that particular defense. And I'm not gonna even lie, like that particular offense, from an offensive standpoint, that's probably like maybe the best offense, from a passing standpoint that I've seen Southern had. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know some people are gonna be like, well, Eric Randall won 2 SWAC championships and Quincy Richard only won 1. But those 2 Eric Randall teams were primarily like run-heavy teams. Even though they had the ability to pass the ball, they were like primarily run-based. Whereas this particular team with Quincy Richard, even though they had the ability to run the ball, they were more pass-happy, if that makes sense. But at the number 1 slot, you have Michael Hayes and Devin Lewis. And I'm not gonna lie, really, it wasn't just Michael Hayes and Devin Lewis, because you also had Altrivian Jobert in the slot. Altrivian Jobert used to do a lot of damage in the slot. So you had Mike Hayes as your primary receiver. You had Devin Lewis as your secondary receiver. And in the slot, you had Altrivian Jobert. And if you didn't keep an eye on him, Pete Richardson used to put Ingram at tight end. Because I remember especially that year in the Bayou Classic, like Terrence Levy would drop back all the time. And if, Hayes was the primary target, wasn't open, Lewis wasn't, Jobert wasn't open, Ingram would be wide open when they would just run him up the middle. They wasn't guarding him at all. That's the reason why he got off so much that year in the Bayou Classic, because, you're trying to pay so much attention to Michael Hayes, Devin Lewis, that Altrivian Jobert in the slot, and then Ingram at tight end. Like, they got a lot of yards where defenses really wasn't paying attention to them, because, Michael Hayes at your primary wide receiver, 6'5", he used to win a higher percentage of his 50-50 balls. He was 6'5", 210, 215. I had a lot of classes with Mike Hayes. Mike Hayes was a dog. And the thing about Mike Hayes, kind of like a lot like Gerard Landry, you couldn't play press coverage on Mike Hayes because Mike Hayes was 6'5", on a low end, like, when he did a lot of running, because, we had classes together in the fall, during the spring and in the summer. And a lot of times, used to do a lot of running. So when he was at his lowest weight, he'd be 205. At his top end weight, he'd be like 215. But you couldn't play press coverage on Mike Hayes because Mike Hayes was too big. He was too strong. That particular version of the Pete Richardson's racehorse offense, it always was more like a West Coast style offense in terms of, the quarterback go through his progression quick. He make his reads quick. And a lot of times they would throw Mike Hayes like curls or stop routes. He'd catch it. And swag swag defensive backs. Swag DBs would be way too small to tackle Mike Hayes in space. He would break a tackle, break a couple tackles. And a lot of times, he'll be off to the races. And he wasn't like super fast like somebody like a Willie Quinn or Kenyatta Sparks, Fred Bailey, James Vernon. He wasn't fast like those guys. So they would catch him, but they wouldn't be strong enough to bring him down. Because I remember one year in the Bayou Classic, Troy Williams threw him a little curl, and he had a long run. He broke the initial tackle, he had a long run, and he got to like the 5. The defensive back tried to tackle him, and he just ran through the tackle and right into the end zone. So, of course, you had Mike Hayes as the primary wide receiver. Like I said, you really couldn't press Mike because he was too big, he was too strong. And then if whoever the quarterback was, whether it was Troy Williams, whether it was Terrence Levy, if you threw him the ball like way down the field in terms of a 50-50 ball, Mike Hayes was 6'5". He had a basketball background. He knew how to post up. He knew how to high point the ball. He came down with a high percentage of his 50-50 balls. So in many instances, especially when Terrence Levy was the quarterback, they really didn't do as much when Troy Williams was the starting quarterback. They would throw him 50-50 balls, and he would come out with them all the time. So Mike Hayes was your primary wide receiver. He was a big NFL prospect at the time. And the reason, and I definitely said you couldn't press him because I remember we had this team sports class, and our teacher, Miss Clark, her son was starting point guard at Southern on the basketball team, but she hadn't made it to class yet. And, they were just kind of a lot of football players, in the class was goofing around. And one of the guys, he was on Southern team too. He was a defensive lineman, but in high school, he was like an all-state offensive and defensive lineman. And he told Mike Hayes, he was like, I bet you I can press you and, you can't get by me. Mike Hayes was like, what? So he tried to cover Mike Hayes in class. Somebody threw him the ball. He tried to play press coverage on Mike Hayes. Mike Hayes fake right and slapped his hands down. And he fell face first on the gym floor and in Stewart Gym. And, of course, Mike Hayes caught the slant and just kind of ran to the opposite end of the gym. But that kind of go to show you this guy was like, even though he wasn't a DB, he talked about how good he was as an offensive lineman in high school, even though he played defensive line in Southern. I can't remember the guy's name, But anyway, that goes to show you how physical and strong Mike Hayes was. So you couldn't press him. And if you, played him too tight, they would throw him a 50-50 ball down the field, and he would come up with a high percentage of the 50-50 balls. That particular year, Mike Hayes was an NFL prospect. And the top wide receiver at Grambling was Scotty Anderson. And he ended up getting drafted in the 7th round. Matt Millen, who played for the 49ers, and he was the general manager of the Detroit Lions. He said a player on the team, he said this in private, was a devout coward. I don't know if he said it in private. I don't know if he said it to the media, but he said a player on the team is a devout coward. He was talking about Scotty Anderson. And one of the guys that played, that I had class with at Southern, he was like, Mike Hayes the best. And he went to a PWI, a mid-major, before he transferred to Southern. He was saying Mike Hayes was the best wide receiver he had played in his entire life. And I'm like, well, bro, what about Scotty Anderson? He was like, Scotty Anderson is a wide receiver. Michael Hayes is a football player. So that tells you how good Michael Hayes was as a number one. Then you had Devin Lewis as the number 2 receiver. The next year, instead of him going to the NFL, Mike Hayes came back. The first game of the year, he broke his leg. He was out for the rest of the year. And then once he went down, Devin Lewis became the primary wide receiver. And the irony is Mike Hayes was 6'5", 215. Devin Lewis was 6'4" and 180. And I remember I had this English class at Southern, and Devin Lewis was in the class. And this was before he really became like a prominent player on the team. And I can't remember this teacher's name. I think her name was like Miss V. Clark. And I remember at the time, Mark Orlando was the offensive coordinator. And Devin Lewis wasn't the only football player in this particular class, but Mark Orlando used to come to class all the time and check on. Gary Jenkins was on his team in the class, and they had like a few other teammates in his class, and he didn't come to check on like all the players. He came to check specifically on Devin Lewis. So I remember, dang, like for Mark Orlando to come to class personally and check on this guy, this dude the dog. You know what I'm saying? So, of course, once Mike Hayes went down, he ended up becoming the primary receiver. And even though they were like about the same height, I think Mike Hayes was like an inch taller. Like they were completely different receivers. Like Devin Lewis was like a fast, run a slant. I'm going to catch a slant and I'm going to make a house call. I'm going to run a curl. I'm going to catch it. I'm going to make the wide receiver miss and I'm going to take it to the house. He was that type of guy, whereas Mike Hayes was I'm going to throw you a short like curl. I'm going to break a tackle. I'm going to get a long run. And before I make it to the end zone, I'm probably going to break another tackle or two. Whereas Devin Lewis was more of a speed guy, whereas Mike Hayes was either a guy that was too strong for SWAT defensive backs, or he was a guy that you could throw 50-50 balls. And then you got to realize at the time, one of the top young receivers in the NFL was Randy Moss. And really before Moss, you didn't see guys like catch a lot of 50-50 balls. And Mike Hayes was the exact same way in terms of he caught a lot of 50-50 balls. So Mike Hayes was the primary receiver. Devin Lewis was the secondary receiver. And like I said, because the two of them got so much attention, Altrevian Joubert, who was in the slot, he got like a lot of passes that teams were not covering him. They just kind of took him for granted. And he caught a lot of passes. And then you had Ingram, who played tight end. A lot of times, Coach Richardson would put him in the game. They would, of course, no running back would be in the game. They would go empty. They would put Ingram at tight end, and either he would just run right up the seam and he'll be wide open, or they'll just throw him a curl. He'll be wide open because Michael Hayes is the primary receiver and Devin Lewis is the secondary receiver. They were garnering so much attention that a lot of other receivers on the wide receiving core will be wide open. But that's it for this Southern University top 5 wide receiver combinations. Just to kind of give you a real brief recap in terms of my combinations. Honorable mention, Earl Petrie III, Jalen Howard, Cassius Allen, Chandler Whitfield, and Darren Morris. Then after that, we had Gerard Landry and James Verner. Then we had Willie Quinn and Mike Jones. Then we had Fred Bailey, Kenyatta Sparks, and Donnell Baker. Then we had Lee Dawson, Willie Quinn, Alfred Arden, Chris Davis, Mike Hayes, and Devin Lewis. Those are my top 5 Southern University wide receiver combinations. If you think I missed a wide receiver combination in terms of a duo, a trio, a group of wide receivers that I missed in terms of that was like a dynamic group, put them in the chat. Also, any top 5, top 10 wide receiver, this wide receiver combination, but any top 10 or top 5 Southern University list. We already did quarterback. We already did running back. We already did wide receiver. This is wide receiver combinations. Actually, this list was supposed to be top 5 Southern University defensive backs. But the GOAT tier status is clear cut in terms of who the top 2 cornerbacks Southern University all time is. I mean, it's easy if you know these 2 guys are NFL Hall of Famers. And in terms of like the 3 under them is easy money. But those last couple, I'm kind of debating who should be under those 3. But that's it for this live stream. Let me shout out everybody that kind of dropped in. Phil Smith, salute. He got Mike Hayes and Keith Woods. Next, we got my brother Brent Fox. Salute to you, fam. Jacob Ward. He had Gerard Landry, Torch the Future. First round pick back in 07. Yeah, I ain't gonna lie. Troy Landry was just savage. Major shout out to Straight to the Point Sports and Entertainment. Salute to your fam. Let me scroll down. My brother Jay Good. Salute to your fam. Aladdin Saddam. Salute fam. Let's see who else. Casanova. Man, I'm not gonna lie, man. This definitely come across is Avis Heat, but even if it ain't Avis Heat, it's definitely a JSU troll. But salute to you anyway. Major shout out to Carlos Brown. Salute to your fam. And major shout out to my brother, Big Joe Towns, standing on LDBC business. That's it for this live stream. I thought it would have probably took about 30 minutes, but of course, I'm a long-winded individual. And again, in the chat section, let me know any wide receiver combination you think I may have missed. Also, give me suggestions for more Southern University top 5, top 10 lists. Also, major shout out to my brother Jerry Lovin Green. Today at 3:30, earlier today, we had a special edition of the Southern Baller Show. Him, myself, Big Joe Town, him and his twin brother JB. So go check them out. Also, go check out my brother Brent Fox on his channel with his show It's Just Me starring Brent Fox. Also, go check out my brother Cadillac Red with his YouTube channel Supreme Beast Boxing Talk. Also, go check out our LDBC sister, the beloved Queen Shawala Yah. And lastly, go check out my brother 7A Sports TV. He has 2 channels. His primary channel is 7A Sports TV. His backup channel is the No 304 Show. I'll catch y'all on the rebound. Y'all have a blessed, phenomenal evening. Peace and blessings. And go Jack.